What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero meets late-night television's most provocative host? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance, only to find himself trapped in a verbal minefield that would shake the entertainment industry to its core. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other, but within minutes, viewers witnessed something unprecedented in late-night television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Harrison Ford walked onto that stage, his weathered face carrying the weight of decades in Hollywood. Unaware that he was about to become the center of one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on live television. The trouble began almost immediately after Ford settled into the guest chair, that familiar leather jacket creaking as he adjusted his position under the harsh studio lights. Kimmel, sporting his usual smirk, wasted no time diving into territory that would prove to be dangerous ground. The host's opening question seemed innocent enough on the surface, but anyone who knows Kimmel's style could sense the calculated provocation lurking beneath. "Harrison, let's talk about your legendary career," Kimmel began, his voice dripping with that trademark sarcasm that has made him both famous and infamous. "You've played some of the most iconic characters in cinema history: Han Solo, Indiana Jones, Rick Deckard. But I have to ask, and I think our audience is curious about this too, don't you think it's time to maybe pass the torch to a younger generation? I mean, you're pushing 82, and some of your recent performances have been, well, let's just say they've sparked some conversation online." The camera immediately cut to Ford's face, and viewers could see his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This was Harrison Ford, a man who had spent decades deflecting Hollywood's most persistent interviewers. But something about Kimmel's tone seemed to hit a nerve. The actor's eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly processing what had just been said. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Jimmy," Ford replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly quality that had made him a household name. "I've been fortunate enough to work with some incredible directors and actors throughout my career, and I'm still passionate about the craft. Age is just a number, and I think my recent work speaks for itself." But Kimmel wasn't finished. The host leaned forward, his expression shifting into something more aggressive, more confrontational than his usual late-night banter. "Come on, Harrison. We've all seen the internet memes, the jokes about your performances in the recent Indiana Jones film. Social media was brutal. Some people are saying you look tired, that maybe you were just phoning it in for the paycheck. How do you respond to critics who say you're tarnishing your own legacy?" The studio audience fell silent, sensing that this wasn't the typical celebrity softball interview they were accustomed to. Ford's publicist, sitting in the wings, could be seen shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her phone already buzzing with messages from concerned executives. The tension in the room was becoming tangible, and viewers at home were beginning to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ford's response was measured but firm. "I've never phoned anything in during my entire career, Jimmy. Every role I take on, I give everything I have. The Indiana Jones character means everything to me, and I would never disrespect the fans or the franchise by giving anything less than my absolute best. I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but I think you might want to reconsider your sources." The host's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam, as if Ford had just walked directly into a trap that had been carefully laid. Kimmel shuffled through his note cards with theatrical precision, clearly building toward something bigger. "Well, speaking of sources, let's talk about some recent reports. There have been some interesting stories coming out of Hollywood lately about your behavior on set. Some crew members from your recent projects have been, let's call them, candid about their experiences working with you." Ford's entire demeanor shifted in that moment. His shoulders squared and his voice took on a harder edge. What exactly are you implying, Jimmy? Because if you have something specific to say, I'd prefer you just say it directly, instead of dancing around whatever point you're trying to make. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and Kimmel seemed to be relishing every moment of it. He leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, clearly enjoying the fact that he had managed to rattle one of Hollywood's most stoic figures. I'm not implying anything, Harrison. I'm just repeating what's been reported. Stories about tardiness, about being difficult to work with, about maybe not being as sharp as you once were. These aren't my words. These are industry professionals talking. The camera captured Ford's face in perfect detail as he processed this accusation. His eyes flashed with something that looked like genuine anger, and for a moment, viewers could see past the carefully constructed public persona to the man underneath. That's absolute nonsense, and you know it. I've worked with the same crews for decades. These people are my friends, my colleagues. If someone has a problem with my work ethic, they're welcome to discuss it with me directly, instead of spreading gossip to late-night talk show hosts. Kimmel's response was swift and cutting. Oh, so now it's gossip? These are professional industry publications, Harrison. Variety, The Hollywood Reporter. Are you calling them liars? The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Ford's hands were visibly gripping the arms of his chair, and his voice had taken on a dangerous quality that anyone familiar with his film roles would recognize. I'm calling you a sensationalist who's more interested in creating drama than having an honest conversation. This isn't journalism, Jimmy. This is tabloid garbage, and I'm not going to sit here and legitimize it with a response. But Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, the host seemed energized by Ford's obvious discomfort. You know what I think, Harrison? I think you're upset because someone finally had the courage to ask you the hard questions. You're used to these promotional interviews where everyone kisses your ass and tells you how wonderful you are. But maybe it's time someone held you accountable for your actions. The word accountable hung in the air like a challenge, and Ford's reaction was immediate and visceral. He straightened in his chair, his eyes boring into Kimmel with an intensity that made the host's smile falter for just a moment. Accountable for what exactly? For having a career that spans 5 decades? For creating characters that have entertained millions of people around the world? For showing up to work every day and giving my best performance regardless of what's happening in my personal life? The studio audience was completely silent now, and the camera operators were scrambling to capture every angle of this unprecedented confrontation. Ford's voice had risen slightly, and there was no mistaking the genuine anger in his tone. You want to talk about accountability, Jimmy? Let's talk about your accountability. You're sitting here attacking a guest on your show, making accusations based on unnamed sources and industry gossip. Where's your accountability for that? Kimmel's expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to something approaching genuine concern, but he had gone too far to back down now. I'm just asking the questions that everyone else is thinking, Harrison. That's my job. Ford's laugh was bitter and humorless. Your job? Your job is to entertain people, not to ambush guests with character assassinations disguised as interviews. This isn't Meet the Press, Jimmy. This is supposed to be a fun, light-hearted conversation about my upcoming projects. Instead, you've turned it into some kind of trial where I'm apparently guilty until proven innocent. The host tried to regain control of the situation, but it was clear that something had fundamentally shifted in the dynamic between them. Look, Harrison, I'm not trying to attack you personally. I'm just trying to have an honest conversation about your career and where you are right now. Isn't that what good journalism is supposed to do? Ford's response was immediate and cutting. Good journalism, Jimmy? You're a comedian who hosts a late-night talk show. You're not Edward R. Murrow, and this isn't some groundbreaking exposé. You're an entertainer who's decided to ambush a guest for ratings. And frankly, I'm disappointed in you and in this entire production. The confrontation had reached a level of intensity that no one in the studio had anticipated, and it was clear that something was about to give. Ford's anger was palpable, and Kimmel seemed to realize that he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures to a breaking point. The host's usual confidence was beginning to crack, and viewers could sense that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. As the commercial break approached, both men were staring at each other across the desk, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Ford's breathing was measured but heavy, and Kimmel's hands were trembling slightly as he shuffled through his note cards. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or simply watch in horrified fascination. What happened next would forever change how Hollywood viewed both men and set the stage for an explosion that would rock the entertainment industry to its core. When they returned from commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had somehow become even more charged. Ford sat rigidly in his chair, his legendary composure hanging by a thread, while Kimmel attempted to regain his trademark smirk. But anyone watching could see that the host was rattled. His usual confidence had been replaced by something approaching desperation as he realized he had awakened a sleeping giant. "Welcome back to Jimmy Kimmel Live," the host announced to the cameras, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that fooled no one. "We're here with Harrison Ford, and we were just having a fascinating discussion about his incredible career." The word fascinating dripped with barely concealed sarcasm, and Ford's eyes narrowed dangerously at the obvious attempt to minimize what had just transpired. Before Ford could respond, Kimmel doubled down with a move that would prove catastrophic. "You know, Harrison, during the break, my producers reminded me of something interesting. They pulled up some old interviews from the 80s, and I have to say, you seemed so much more energetic back then. Full of life. What happened to that guy? When did you become so serious all the time?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Ford's reaction was immediate and volcanic. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he spoke, his voice carried a controlled fury that made everyone in the studio freeze. "What happened to that guy?" "Life happened, Jimmy. Decades of hard work, of showing up every day, of dealing with people like you who think they can reduce a person's entire existence to a punchline for their late-night comedy routine." Kimmel's eyes lit up with malicious glee, sensing that he had struck a nerve. "Oh, so now I'm the problem. Harrison, you're the one who's been sitting here getting defensive about every question I ask. Maybe the real issue is that you can't handle honest criticism anymore. Maybe you've been surrounded by yes men for so long that you've forgotten what real feedback sounds like." The accusation was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Ford leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Yes, men. Jimmy, I've worked with some of the most demanding directors in Hollywood history. George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Ridley Scott. These are men who pushed me to be better every single day. The difference between them and you is that they had talent, vision, and respect for the craft. You're just a failed comedian who's found a way to make money by tearing down people who are actually accomplished." The studio audience gasped audibly at this verbal assault, and Kimmel's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. His carefully constructed persona was cracking, revealing something uglier underneath. "Failed comedian? I have one of the most successful talk shows on television, Harrison. I've won awards. I've hosted the Oscars multiple times. What have you done lately besides coast on work you did 30 years ago?" Ford's laugh was cold and bitter. "What have I done lately? I've continued to work with integrity, Jimmy. I've maintained relationships with people who matter in this industry. I've earned the respect of my peers through decades of professionalism. You want to know what I think you've done? You've turned late-night television into a cesspool of mean-spirited attacks and cheap shots. You've taken what Johnny Carson and David Letterman built and turned it into a circus." The mention of Carson and Letterman seemed to strike Kimmel particularly hard. and his response was swift and vicious. "Don't you dare lecture me about Carson and Letterman. Those guys would have asked you the same hard questions I'm asking. The difference is they had guests who could handle it. You're sitting here having a meltdown because someone finally had the courage to point out that the emperor has no clothes." Ford's composure finally snapped completely. He stood up from his chair, his full height towering over the desk, as he stared down at Kimmel with undisguised contempt. "Meltdown? You think this is a meltdown? Jimmy, I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I have dealt with studio executives, demanding directors, impossible shooting schedules, and media scrutiny that would crush most people. What I'm having right now isn't a meltdown. It's a moment of clarity, where I realize I'm wasting my time talking to someone who has no concept of what real work actually looks like." The host scrambled to regain control of the situation, but Ford wasn't finished. "You want to talk about hard questions? Let's talk about some hard questions. How many of your writers have you driven away with your toxic behavior? How many guests have left your show feeling humiliated and disrespected? How many people in this industry genuinely like you, Jimmy, versus how many just tolerate you because you have a platform they need?" Kimmel's face had gone pale, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely speechless. But Ford pressed on, his voice gaining strength and conviction with every word. "I've been in this town for 50 years, and I've seen people like you come and go. You think you're untouchable because you have ratings and a network behind you. But you're not. You're just another in a long line of people who mistake cruelty for wit and think that tearing others down makes them bigger." The studio was dead silent except for the sound of Ford's voice, which had taken on an almost prophetic quality. Camera operators were frantically adjusting their shots, sensing that they were capturing something historic. "You asked me what happened to that energetic guy from the 80s. He grew up, Jimmy. He learned that life is too short to waste on people who don't deserve your time or respect. He learned to value authenticity over performance, substance over style." Kimmel finally found his voice, but it was shaky and uncertain. "Harrison, I think you're overreacting here. This is just television. We're just having a conversation." Ford's response was immediate and devastating. "Just television, Jimmy. This is someone's life you're talking about. These are real people with real feelings, real careers, real families who watch this garbage. When you sit behind that desk and make jokes about someone's age, their appearance, their work, you're not just entertaining people. You're contributing to a culture of meanness that's poisoning this entire industry." The host tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Look, Harrison, I'm sorry if you feel like I've been unfair. That wasn't my intention. I'm just trying to do my job here." But Ford was beyond redemption at this point. His voice rose to a level that filled the entire studio, and his words carried the weight of decades of pent-up frustration with the entertainment industry's toxic culture. Your job is to make people laugh, to bring joy into their lives, to celebrate the things that make us human. Instead, you've chosen to make your living by humiliating people who are brave enough to sit in that chair and promote their work. You've weaponized your platform against the very people who make your show possible. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ford's anger was righteous and pure. The fury of a man who had spent his entire career maintaining his dignity only to have it attacked by someone he clearly viewed as unworthy of his respect. "I've sat through thousands of interviews over the years. Jimmy, I've been asked every question imaginable, dealt with every type of host, handled every kind of situation, but I've never, in all my years in this business, encountered someone so determined to make their guest feel small and insignificant." Kimmel's attempts to interrupt were futile, as Ford continued his verbal assault. "You know what the saddest part is? You actually have talent. You could be using this platform to uplift people, to celebrate their achievements, to create moments of genuine connection and joy. Instead, you've chosen to be a bully with a microphone. And that's a tragedy for everyone involved. The camera captured every nuance of Ford's expression as he delivered what felt like a final verdict on not just Kimmel, but on the entire culture of modern entertainment. His voice carried the authority that came from decades of experience and success, and his words seemed to resonate with the truth that cut through all the artificial glamour of the television studio. As Ford stood there, towering over the desk, his jacket slightly askew and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration, viewers could see that this wasn't just an angry celebrity having a tantrum. This was a man who had reached his breaking point with an industry that had lost its way, and he was channeling the frustration of every actor, director, and creative professional who had ever been subjected to the kind of treatment he was experiencing. The tension in the studio had reached an almost unbearable level. Ford's chest rose and fell with barely controlled emotion, while Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, realizing that he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures too far. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or watch in horrified fascination as one of the most explosive confrontations in television history unfolded. What happened next would cement this moment as one of the most shocking exits in late-night television history. Ford's eyes swept across the studio audience, taking in their stunned faces before returning to Kimmel with a look of pure disgust. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the nervous shuffling of crew members who had never witnessed anything like this. When Ford finally spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute finality. "You know what, Jimmy? I'm done." The words were simple, but they carried the force of a thunderclap in the hushed studio. "I'm done with this conversation. I'm done with this interview. And I'm done with people like you, who think that cruelty is entertainment." Kimmel's face went from pale to ashen as he realized that Ford wasn't just venting his frustration, he was preparing to leave. The host's voice cracked as he tried to salvage the situation. "Harrison, come on. Let's just take a breath here. We can start over. Talk about your new projects. Keep things light. That's what people want to see." Ford's laugh was harsh and mirthless. "Start over, Jimmy. There is no starting over from this. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I've shown you exactly what I think of it. The audience has seen it all, and they can make their own judgments about what just happened here." The camera caught Ford reaching down to unhook his microphone. His movements were deliberate and methodical. Every person in the studio watched in fascination as one of Hollywood's biggest stars prepared to walk away from a live television interview. The symbolic weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. This was Harrison Ford, a man who had faced down Imperial stormtroopers and Nazi soldiers on screen, refusing to be intimidated by a late-night talk show host. "Harrison, please," Kimmel pleaded, his carefully constructed persona completely abandoned now. "Don't do this. We can work this out. I was just trying to have some fun. Ask some provocative questions. That's what makes for good television." Ford paused in his microphone removal, his eyes boring into Kimmel with an intensity that made the host visibly shrink back in his chair. "Good television, Jimmy? What you call good television, I call a disgrace to the medium. You had an opportunity tonight to have a real conversation with someone who's lived an extraordinary life, who's worked with legendary directors and actors, who's been part of some of the most beloved films in cinema history. Instead, you chose to turn it into a circus." The microphone came free with a soft pop, and Ford held it in his hand like a weapon. "You want to know what good television looks like? It looks like respect. It looks like preparation. It looks like caring about your guests enough to ask them questions that matter. Not just fishing for sound bites that will go viral on social media." Kimmel's desperation was palpable now. "Harrison, you're one of my heroes. I grew up watching your movies, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Blade Runner. These films shaped my childhood. I never meant to disrespect you personally." Ford's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "If I'm really one of your heroes, Jimmy, then you have a funny way of showing it. Heroes aren't perfect, and they don't expect to be treated like they are. But they do expect to be treated with basic human dignity. That's something you seem to have forgotten how to do." The studio audience was completely captivated, watching this real-time dissolution of a television interview with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. Ford placed the microphone carefully on the desk, the small gesture somehow carrying more weight than any dramatic flourish could have achieved. He learned that energy without purpose is just noise. He learned that being entertaining doesn't give you the right to be cruel. He learned that respect is earned, not demanded, and that once you lose it, it's very hard to get back. Ford began to move around the desk, his movements unhurried but determined. The cameras tracked his every step, and the audience held its collective breath. "I've been in this business for 50 years, Jimmy. I've seen hosts who could make their guests feel like the most important person in the world, who could find the humor in situations without making anyone the butt of the joke. Carson, Letterman, even Conan, they all had that gift. You could have had it too, but you chose a different path." Kimmel made one final desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. "Harrison, please don't leave like this. Give me another chance. Let me show you that I can be better than this." Ford stopped his movement toward the stage exit and turned back to face Kimmel directly. For a moment, there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "Jimmy, the chance to be better than this was every single day you've been hosting the show. It was every interview you've conducted, every guest you've welcomed, every opportunity you've had to choose kindness over cruelty. You don't get to ask for another chance after you've shown someone exactly who you are." The weight of Ford's words seemed to crush whatever fight remained in Kimmel. The host slumped in his chair, his usual animated gestures replaced by a defeated stillness. "I'm sorry, Harrison. I'm truly sorry." Ford nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology without accepting it. "I believe you are sorry, Jimmy. But being sorry doesn't undo what just happened. It doesn't change the fact that you thought it was acceptable to ambush a guest on your show. It doesn't change the fact that you've probably done this to other people who didn't have the luxury of walking away." The studio fell silent except for the hum of the cameras and the distant sound of traffic outside. Ford's presence dominated the space even as he prepared to leave it. "I want to say something to your audience, Jimmy, to the people who are watching this at home." He looked directly into the camera, his weathered face filled with a dignity that had only been enhanced by the confrontation. "This isn't about me, and it isn't really about Jimmy. This is about how we treat each other, whether we're on television or in our daily lives. Fame doesn't make you immune to hurt. Success doesn't mean you have to accept being treated badly. And entertainment should never come at the expense of someone's dignity." Ford's voice grew stronger as he continued, speaking directly to the millions of viewers who were witnessing this unprecedented moment. "I've been incredibly fortunate in my career. I've had the chance to play characters that people love, to work with talented people, to be part of stories that have meant something to audiences around the world. But none of that would matter if I couldn't look at myself in the mirror and know that I've tried to treat people with respect." The camera captured every nuance of Ford's expression as he delivered what felt like a final statement. "Life is too short to waste on people who don't value what you bring to the table. Whether you're an actor, a teacher, a construction worker, or anything else, you deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." With that, Ford turned and walked toward the stage exit with the same purposeful stride that had carried him through countless movie scenes. The studio audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It wasn't the polite applause of a talk show audience. It was the kind of genuine emotional response that comes from witnessing something real and powerful. Ford paused at the edge of the stage, not to acknowledge the applause, but to take one final look at the scene he was leaving behind. Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, his show in ruins, his carefully constructed persona shattered. The host's eyes were glazed with what might have been tears, and his hands trembled as he stared at his note cards without seeing them. The cameras caught Ford's final moment on stage, not as a character in a movie, but as a man who had reached his limit and chosen to walk away with his dignity intact. There was something almost cinematic about the way he disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a studio full of people who knew they had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. As the applause finally died down, Kimmel attempted to regain his composure, but it was clear that something fundamental had changed. His voice was barely above a whisper as he addressed the stunned audience. "We'll be right back after these messages." The camera lingered on Kimmel's face for a moment longer than usual, capturing the full weight of what had just transpired. The host's usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked almost like shame, and viewers could see that this wasn't just a bad interview. It was a moment of reckoning that would define both men's legacies. The red light on the cameras flickered off, signaling the commercial break, but the damage was already done. In the span of one interview, Jimmy Kimmel had managed to alienate one of Hollywood's most respected figures, expose his own character flaws to millions of viewers, and create a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Harrison Ford had walked onto that stage as a guest promoting his latest project. He walked off as a man who had reminded everyone watching what it means to stand up for yourself with grace and dignity. In doing so, he had delivered one of the most powerful performances of his entire career, and it hadn't required a single line of scripted dialogue.